What will it take to convince us to believe Jesus? What will it take to convince us to do what he says? What will it take to convince us to surrender our entire lives to him? This is the second teaching that we have in a row in St. Luke's gospel on the care of the poor, reminding us of how integral the treatment of the poor is to the very heart of the gospel. Jesus tells us in Matthew's gospel that the way we care for the poor tells us how we would treat him. That how we treat the poor will be taken as the attitude that we have towards Jesus Christ. There's a great chasm between Lazarus and the rich man in the netherworld because there was a great chasm between Lazarus and the rich man in life. As I read this parable of Jesus, I can't help but be reminded of another 19th century parable. Now, I don't want to alarm anyone, but I did see on the news this morning that it's 100 days until Christmas. Do you guys know the story that I'm thinking of right away? It's A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, where a man comes back from the dead to tell and warn his business partner in life that terrible things await him in the next world if he does not learn how to better care for the poor and the needy and those in need of mercy around him. One of my favorite scenes from that movie is when Marley's ghost confronts Scrooge, and Scrooge says to him, "Oh, but Jacob, you were an excellent man of business." And the ghost retorts, "Business! Mankind was my business. Mercy, benevolence, and forbearance were my business. The common welfare was my business. The matters of my trade were just a drop in the ocean of what is my business." Basic humanity teaches us that we have an obligation to care for the poorest of the poor in our society. That if we see someone who is hurt and suffering, we have a duty, an obligation to do everything we can in order to alleviate that from them. Mercy is the job of the Christian. Mercy's at the heart of the law. This man is named Lazarus in the gospel today. It's very interesting because the rich man isn't named. And Lazarus was the third most common name in first century Judea. It's Eleazar is kind of how you might say it in Hebrew. It means God helps. It's an apt name for this person. But the very fact that he's named says that the one that was discarded by society, the one that the rich man decided was not even worth the time of considering, is the one whose name is known to God, the one who's beloved, and the one who will receive God's mercy. This is a beautiful reminder to us of a central doctrine of Christianity, a central teaching of Jesus, and that is the preferential option of the poor. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells us that we will be judged. Our salvation will depend on how we treat those who are in need of mercy. Are we feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the sick, visiting the imprisoned, giving drink to the thirsty, burying the dead, doing all of these corporal works of mercy? For a Christian, corporal works of mercy aren't optional. They're mandatory. Indeed, the teaching of Jesus alludes that not only will we individually be judged, but entire nations will be judged on how they care for the poor. So, preferential option for the poor, my brothers and sisters, is again not an option. It's the option that is not an option. Jesus shows us solidarity with the poor. And we too are called to do everything we can. So really, the corporal works of mercy should be a checklist, right? What have I done this week to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give drink to the thirsty, visit the sick, visit the imprisoned. What have I done to care for the physical needs of my brothers and sisters? What have I done to help those? Have I done everything that I'm able to do? Because this rich man was able to do it and he chose not to. But there's another point to this gospel that has to do with the irony, the ironic, strong note on which Jesus ends that I'd like to focus on for the rest of the message here this morning. And to give us context, we actually have to see what is said before the selection that the church gives us today. We're in Luke chapter 16. The reading starts at verse 19. But we have to see what happens in verse 14. If you remember, Jesus gave a parable last week that talked about how you can't serve two masters. You can't serve both God and money. And then it says the Pharisees, verse 14, the Pharisees who were lovers of money heard all this and scoffed at him. The word for scoff there literally means they wrinkled their nose. They showed him contempt. But he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts, for what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God." The law and the prophets were until John. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone enters it violently. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. The Pharisees prided themselves in their observance of the law and their strict rules for worship because they believed that it was in observing Torah that they offered perfect worship to God. But while maybe perhaps following the letter of the law, they abandoned the heart of the law, the love of God and love of neighbor. They ignored the warnings of the prophets, such as the prophet Amos gives in our first reading today, reminding the rulers of Israel that they have an obligation towards mercy. But Jesus ends this with an ironic comment, an ironic statement. Abraham said, "If they will not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither would they be persuaded if someone should rise from the dead." Now, Jesus raised people from the dead. He raised the son of the widow. He raised the daughter of Jairus. And he also raised a friend of his from the dead. And his friend's name was Lazarus. Oh, wait. It's as if all of these things fit together. And who was not convinced at the resurrection of Lazarus, but called it a scam and a hoax? The Pharisees. The very ones that he's talking about today. But the irony of what Jesus is saying doesn't end there. He's talking about his own resurrection. His own resurrection would not convince the hardness of the hearts of the Pharisees to turn away, to accept that the Messiah had come and to follow him. What's it going to take for us to follow Jesus? I'd like to maybe address some of us that might be here, or maybe a message you can share with your friends who might be a little bit skeptical about Jesus, skeptical about the resurrection, and skeptical about the Gospels, because we live in a very skeptical society. I think we respond in a way to where we don't acknowledge the resurrection of Jesus from the dead as being a turning point in our faith that should move us to believe in him. And a lot of people dismiss the claim that Jesus rose from the dead by saying, "Oh, that's not even what the first Christians believed. That's something that was invented later." So let's talk for a moment about the historical reliability of the Gospels. Because a lot of times people are going to say, well, the Gospels are not historically reliable. Now, can I get a little academic with y'all? Good. When we look at establishing the validity of a historical text, something is used called textual criticism. And what textual criticism does is it looks at when the ancient writing was alleged to have been written, what is the oldest manuscript that we have, because we don't have any of the original manuscripts. They're written on papyrus that they disintegrated years ago. And the next thing we'll look at is how many existing copies of the manuscript do we have today that we can verify against each other to see if they are free from errors. So I'm going to give you some examples of this principle. Oh, and then the third thing we look at is, are there other texts of the time that are contemporary that make a reference to this historical text or to the events that happened therein? So let me give you an example of this applied to works of the ancient world that are well accepted. So the writings of Herodotus and Thucydides. This is one of the they're ancient Greek historians. They wrote in the 5th century BC, and the surviving copies that we have of their manuscript is from about 900 AD. So that is a 1,300-year gap. And we have about 8 copies of the manuscript. Yet there is no serious historian that will question their authenticity. The writings of Livy's Roman history, one of the greatest works on Roman history. Nobody questions its validity. It was written around 27 BC. The remaining fragments that we have come 900 years after that time, and we have about 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic Wars. Maybe you guys have heard of that. The writings of Julius Caesar. This is where we know about the war and the military operations of Julius Caesar. He wrote that in about 51 BC. The earliest manuscript we have comes about 950 years later, and there's about 9 or 10 copies. But I don't know about y'all, but I haven't heard anyone questioning if Julius Caesar existed. Have you? I think it's pretty much given historical fact that Julius Caesar existed and that his military operations were real. Tacitus, another famous Roman historian of the 1st century, who, by the way, mentions Christians, but I'll get to that in a moment. He wrote in the 1st century, wrote 100 AD, beginning of the 2nd century, and there's about a 1,000-year gap between when he wrote and the earliest surviving manuscript, and we have about 20 copies. Now, so again, these are works that no serious historian will doubt are validly written by the person who says they wrote them from the time period in which they say they are written. Now, let's apply this same principle of textual criticism to the New Testament. Are you following me so far? I know we're a little complicated, but this is good stuff. Okay, so the New Testament was written between about 40 and 100 AD, depending on who you talk to. I'm going to say between 40 and 100 AD. They used to say, St. John was written way later. It was written in 150 AD, except for the fact that we have a fragment from St. John's Gospel that goes back to 130 AD now. So that is a 30 to 70 year gap between the time of the writings of the Gospels, and that's the latest Gospel, and the earliest manuscript that we have. Would you like to guess how many manuscripts we have? Over 5,000 Greek manuscripts, over 10,000 Latin manuscripts, over 9,000 manuscripts in other languages. The New Testament is unparalleled. The Gospels are unparalleled to any other biography or historical account in terms of the veracity of their authenticity. Not to mention that, yes, we have mention of Jesus and Christianity by other people. Josephus, Jewish historian, wrote around 53 AD, mentions Jesus. Now, some used to say, well, we believe that that's something that was written later by the Christians, except for we found some Arabic copies earlier that seem to say that he also mentioned Jesus. Now, the Christians might have written a little note in there that kind of made them look a little bit better than the original, but he still mentions that Jesus was someone who they believe was the Messiah, that they believe rose from the dead. Tacitus, who I mentioned, also same thing. Not to mention that apart from the scripture, if we take the writings of what we call the ante-Nicene fathers of the church, these are the earliest church fathers, the Christians who wrote for the first 3 centuries of Christianity. If we took just their quotations of the scriptures alone, of the Gospels alone, we could assemble the Gospels just from that. I have to say this because these days there's a lot of silly people that say things like, well, you know, this whole idea that Jesus was divine was invented by Constantine. You know, Constantine wrote the Bible. Constantine is the real founder of the Catholic Church. Ever heard that one before? There were over 30 popes before Constantine. The church was well established. The writings of Christians existed long before this. Why am I going into all of this here this morning? Because I want to make something abundantly clear. I'm about to give you concise historical facts that cannot be refuted by anyone who takes history seriously. Undisputed historical fact. Jesus of Nazareth existed. Jesus of Nazareth claimed that he was both Messiah and God. And his followers say that he rose from the dead. And they say that he rose from the dead, was seen and observed by multiple witnesses. They saw him do ordinary things like eating and drinking and moving about. And for their belief in his resurrection, they died. Why would they lie? Why would they make it up? Where did their testimony of the resurrection get them? Burned alive, boiled in oil, burned at the stake, flayed alive, crucified in all sorts of different torturous manners, thrown from buildings, fed to lions, and stoned to death. Why would they be willing to go to such extremes for a lie? The point I'm trying to make, my brothers and sisters, is that I believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And I believe that the historical evidence to support this claim is absolutely overwhelming. Which makes me return to the question I asked at the beginning of this message. What will it take to convince us to follow Jesus? Jesus said that if we're unwilling to listen to the prophets who teach us to show mercy and compassion, to teach us to love God and neighbor above all else, to teach us to shed our own comfort in favor of following God and his plans in our lives, if we are unconvinced by that prophetic message, then we likely wouldn't be convinced even if someone, I don't know, rose from the dead.